Hello, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining our first LinkedIn Live. My name is Caitlin Trent, and I am the Global Plastics Treaty Coordinator at Greenpeace USA, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. In the next 60 minutes, we'll be discussing how to achieve a strong and ambitious global plastics treaty, focusing on the critical demand of reducing plastic production. But before we start, I have two notes for our audience here. So, of course, please feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat, and we will try to address them at the end of the discussion if we have time today. Then also, please feel free to invite more listeners to watch the live stream by sharing this event on your LinkedIn page or by sending a quick DM to any interested colleagues right now. Go ahead and take a minute and invite some friends to watch. Okay, let's get started. So we're just 2 weeks away from the second round of global plastics treaty negotiations in Paris, and we have until 2024 to ensure it's as strong and ambitious as possible. So how do we define ambition, and how will we win a treaty that will effectively turn off the plastics tap? That's what we're going to be discussing today with our panel of policy experts and INC2 delegates. So before we start our discussion, I want to set the stage by introducing today's panelists that were joined today. Okay, so first up, we have Chris Dixon, an oceans campaign lead at the Environmental Investigation Agency. Thanks for joining us, Chris. Good morning, good afternoon. We also have Hiro, who is a senior political and external affairs officer at Greenpeace Japan. Good evening, Hiro. Thank you for joining us in your evening. And we also have Griffins, who is the director at the Center for Environmental Justice and Development. Thanks for joining us, Griffins. So now that everyone has been introduced, let's get into question one. We have just about 60 minutes to discuss all about the Global Plastics Treaty, so let's get started. So question one, and Chris, I'm going to direct this question to you to start, and then feel free, Hiro and Griffins, to jump in. So what do we need in a global plastics treaty to end the age of plastic? So over to you, Chris, to get us started.
Okay, a big question, I think, as an opener, but certainly an interesting one and really relevant to what's going to be discussed as part of the plastics treaty negotiations. In my view, in order to really deal with plastic pollution and to end plastic pollution, that's the task that's been handed to negotiators working on the new treaty. We need to deal with plastic production. And of course, this needs to be legally binding. So we need something legally binding that holds companies and countries accountable to the idea of reducing the amount of plastic that we're producing. If we don't do that effectively, we're going to really struggle with every other policy measure that we design for this treaty. And I think, there's ways that it can be done, but certainly an approach would be to start with dealing with problematic chemicals and polymers, so those that we know already are hazardous and toxic, but we really need to deal with overall plastic production volumes and think about, how do we design a treaty that's going to be effective in doing that and ensure that there's a just transition for workers who are currently involved in all elements of the plastic value chain, but also how do we design solutions that are really system change scenarios around, for example, reuse systems, refill, that kind of thing.
Hiro, Griffins, anything to add?
Thank you so much for the question. I really believe, as mentioned by my colleague Chris, that to address the plastic pollution that we have currently globally, is that we have to address the overproduction of plastic pollution. So we do have an opportunity in this negotiation process to have a clear curbing of plastic production discussion on how we can be able to stop or reduce the production in order to reduce the pollution. The second element that I want to bring out is the element of the exposure of plastic and inherent chemicals and additives in plastic that brings out the health challenges that many communities face, particularly in developing countries where we have a lot of exposure on how these are disposed and managed at the moment. Communities, people working in different areas are exposed to the chemical through disposal methods like burning. So the other discussion that we have is to protect health as a key important issue for people and populations, because health, we must ensure that we protect our health, just like we had the situation of COVID, which made the world come to a stop because of the health issue. So this is the same in terms of how do we protect our health in order to have healthy populations. So I think these are very critical, among others that have also been mentioned by my colleague Chris in the discussions. Thank you.
Then thanks. I think most of the key points have been already raised. So I would like to maybe add another aspect of to this discussion. So that I think one of the key components we have to integrate in this treaty is a just transition, the fair and just transition for workers and for the people live on this across the entire life cycle. And it's going to be crucial that this treaty will really leave no one behind in the process to end the plastic pollutions. Obviously, we have to sort of a lot of questions around the production, how we gonna prioritize the use, and also what we gonna phase out, etc. But also we have to think about those people who live on the life ecosystem of plastics, those doing the waste pickers, doing collection, sorting, and then contributing to the recycling of the plastics or any other variable materials, for example. So obviously we know the issue of the recycling or dumping and so on. Besides, the point is still the people are dependent on those things, so that we have to start the conversation that this treaty must have components that help and that really ensure the just transition to take place.
Well said. Very good points from everyone. I know that was a big question to start out with, but I'm going to move us to our second question here. And we are getting some questions in the chat, which is wonderful. So I'm sure we're going to have time to get to those at the end. But question 2, we know that INC 1 was highly procedural. What can we expect for INC 2? Griffins, Chris, I know you were both at INC 1 along with me. What can we expect at INC 2?
Griffins, do you want to take that one first, or shall I go?
Yeah, thank you. I can take that first. So what we do expect at INC2 is that we do already have the working document, which is called the potential options or the elements paper that gives various options on the various items to define the treaty. So the objectives, what will be the legally binding obligations, what will be, for instance, voluntary measures, control measures, financing mechanism, among others. So we expect the negotiators to be able to look at these options, and then we are able to, discuss these options and come up with what we call the zero draft, which is basically the draft of the treaty document for a basis for negotiations in INC3. And there we will also expect that there will be a mandate provided on how to develop this zero draft to guide the negotiations of INC3, which is a sequential process before we adopt the instrument. So this is what I think is expected for the next discussions in INC2.
I could add something to that as well, although I think, Griffins, you just did a great job of deconstructing a process which is really complicated into something that even I can understand. I think another thing that will be really important to think about is that the treaty that's being negotiated doesn't actually have an objective yet. So that sounds mad, but that's true. So in the options paper that Griffin's talked about, there's some proposed objectives. So essentially, every international agreement has something that it's trying to do. And the potential objectives that are in the options paper are based on what member states have proposed. And the good thing is that, both Griffins and Hero talked about the kind of human aspects or the human dimensions of the issue of plastic pollution. And human human health and the environment are reflected in all of the potential objectives for the treaty. So that's good. I think that's actually a really good basis to start negotiations, because we're already starting from a point of recognition of human health impacts. Maybe not quite human rights yet, but definitely human health. So that's something that would be also agreed, at least a working definition of what the objectives are going to be. And the paper that the options paper that Griffin's talked about, that's going to be how the negotiations are structured. So the likely way that the negotiations will run is having kind of two parallel working groups. So one working group or contact group would be dealing with the kind of control measures and core obligations. That's basically, the stuff that we want to do in the treaty. So like production caps, reuse, refill, waste management, that kind of thing. And then the other is the sort of how, so the implementation. So is it through national action plans? How will it be financed? And although that kind of implementation section might not sound quite as sexy, it's really critical. It's certainly technical and procedural, but it's the stuff that will, without a good financial mechanism, the treaty will fail. So that really important stuff will be happening in what sounds like quite a dry contact group. So I really recommend people who are attending follow what's going on in the implementation conversations. And aside from that, there is some procedural stuff that's on the agenda, but unless anyone who's listening is really excited, I won't go into it. So I'll save that for the Q&A.
Chris, you said something that made me think of another question to ask, actually, which is related to the process and procedure here. What other treaty models, examples are we looking at? So I hear lots of people talking about the Montreal Protocol. Of course, we're going to be in Paris, where another very famous treaty was discussed. So I'm curious, what examples do you think negotiators are drawing upon for this process?
That's a really interesting question, and like nerdy, but in a really great way. I love it. When we first started talking about the plastics treaty, I heard a lot of kind of Paris for plastics type ideas being thrown around, and that just made me want to go run screaming into the hills, because whilst I think no one's denying that the negotiation of the Paris Agreement was a huge achievement, on the implementation side, not necessarily a huge success. And so there are a number of countries that are proposing a model very similar to the Paris Agreement. So that's, if you hear reference to a kind of bottom-up approach, so this idea of having a treaty that's based around nationally determined contributions or national action plans, that's a kind of Paris model. And there are a number of countries who are looking at that, but I would say the majority of countries are looking at something a bit different, more of a top-down approach. So that means kind of global rules, global targets, that are sort of like more binding at the global level. So the Montreal Protocol is a really good example of that. And, at EIA, we also work on the Montreal Protocol, and it's considered to be the most successful multilateral environmental agreement in the land. We're not talking about the hole in the ozone layer in the same way that we were in the 1980s and 1990s. And that's because the Montreal Protocol was so successful in addressing that source of ozone depletion. So I think looking at the Montreal Protocol as a model is a really good one. Negotiators are also looking at the Minamata Convention, which I don't work on, but I think Griffin's does. So I wouldn't even dare to speak about that. But certainly there's a lot of similarities with the way that the Plastics Treaty is being proposed to be structured, and sort of drawing some inspiration from Minamata as well, which deals with mercury.
Thanks for letting me throw that extra question in there. We're moving pretty quickly, so I'll be looking for the chat for extra questions as we go, and then also letting us truly have a conversation here. So moving to our next question, why is plastic reduction so critical in achieving a strong global plastics treaty? And if Griffins, if you want to start us off, over to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, that question is critical, and I want to answer it this way with an example or illustration. So for you are opening your tap of water, and then you are collecting the water, and then you cleaning up, maybe then you continue to open that water tap. It means that you are going to be just in a perpetual kind of cleaning. So the importance of closing or reducing the production gives us a clear way on how to manage the plastic that we currently have in the environment, which is already brought us to these discussions in a global treaty negotiations, that it's creating a lot of pollution. that which is visible and invisible. So we have to ensure that to address this, we have to first look at the source of the problem, which is that the production phase, then make us stop or a reduction in the production of plastics, and eliminating in the process some of the processing and how process, including how we make the plastics when making reference to the exposures through chemical additives, problematic polymers, and among others. So this is the best illustration I can give on how to address this problem and we come to a solution.
I would love to add something to that, if that's okay. I think that, Griffin's, thank you for giving that illustration. I think it's just very, we've heard this idea of the tap, but I think it's just so, it's so illustrative of the reality that we're facing, that we already exist in an environment where for a number of years national governments, companies, even international instruments have tried to deal with elements of the plastic pollution problem, whether it's dumping at sea, whether it's fishing gear under the FAO, whatever it is, or a plastic bag ban at the national level. But these things have all failed to adequately address the scale of the problem, and it's not for want of trying. It's just the lack of a kind of global coordination. And when it comes to plastic production, the situation that we're facing right now is that we're operating in an environment where we don't have access to a lot of information which would inform decision making. For example, there's no legal requirement to report on the amount of plastic being produced. There's no requirement to report on petrochemical feedstocks. There's no reporting requirements around trade, import, export. We also don't know what's even in a lot of plastics. There was a report that was launched, I think it was even just last week, talking about the 13,000 chemicals that are found in plastics, and a quarter of those are substances of concern, yet there's no legal requirement for producers to tell us what's in plastics, chemicals that are used in plastics. So then what happens is those plastics are produced, they go into many different kinds of products, not just packaging, but every plastic that we encounter in our daily lives. And they're also then collected and recycled. And we're told that recycling is some wonderful solution, but what we're actually doing is just toxic recycling. So if it's even possible to recycle, because we also know that recycling rates are incredibly low, less than 10%. So we're in a problem where we're just kind of like a little hamster, where you can't see the legs, running and trying to deal with the problem. But actually the solutions are what we call upstream. We need to deal with production. We need transparency. We need mandatory reporting. We need producers of plastic to actually be accountable for the products that they're putting on the market, telling us how much they're producing and telling us what's in them. Otherwise, it's very difficult for policymakers to make any informed decisions. And that's the kind of key piece of the plastics treaty that we need to get right, the design of those obligations around plastic production, and also how that then links into, this idea of the circular economy. We keep being told that, the circular economy is the solution to all of our problems. But, there's no such thing as a circular economy if we can't get rid of toxics and we can't practically collect and recycle the plastics that would feed that circular economy. So that's just something to kind of add to what Griffin said.
Thanks for that, Chris. Hero, anything to add?
Thanks. I'd like to actually highlight the production. Why we have to sort of address the production is not just about dichotomy between sort of the production side and then kind of downstream side, but actually it goes hand in hand. What I mean is when you have abundance of subsidized virgin plastic coming into the market, there's no way that reuse, refill, repair, all of those which should be our future, but still currently labor intensive, and obviously it's gonna it takes more labor than the newly produced virgin plastic, which is polluting the environment right now. So in order to actually realize the future of reuse, repair, refill, those things, we have to limit the supply of the plastics so that the alternative ways have at the same level the playing field. And obviously, it's not because that we limit the supply, they're going to be the same level. No, it's actually that because the production is so easy, that we created a system that make it so easy that the appropriate ways to actually consume and then do things differently are just too expensive for that matter. So we are, in order to make things fair to the actual solution that we are talking about, such as already repeated 3 times, reuse, repair, refill, you have to limit the supply. So it's not like, some people might say, well, recycling the future, fine. I mean, even you believe in that, then you can't compete with the virgin by any means. So I think whatever position you have on the downstream solutions, I think we can all agree that supply needs to be limited in order for the better solutions to be competitive.
Well said, Hiro. Always good to bring in an economic perspective into these things. We have a question in the chat, Chris. Actually, you mentioned the report on chemicals that came out, I think, last week. If you are willing to share that report with folks, that would be amazing. Folks are asking for it. It's in high demand in the chat. So if you want to send the link to the report over to me, and then we can get it in the chat for folks. I'm looking at the other questions in the chat to see if there's anything that feeds in directly to this question. Yeah, let's keep moving. Anyone else want to say one last thing on production before we keep moving?
I do.
Yeah, Chris, go for it.
Yeah, I thought Hiro just made a really great point, and I don't know if any of us really kind of got into this in detail, but it was about the wonky market dynamics that exist where, it's cheaper to buy virgin plastic than it is to buy recycled plastic. And like, if we just kind of take a step and not get into the kind of toxicity conversation, but just think about it from a purely kind of like market hat, because we kind of have this challenge, right, where all these companies make these targets where they're voluntary targets, and they always miss them, where they say, we want X amount of recycled content in our plastics, and they basically never hit those targets, and they're not really accountable because it's not a legal commitment or anything like that. But also, when you talk to them, a lot of what you get back is that, well, it's actually just a huge market disincentive. It's cheaper to buy virgin plastics than it is to buy recycled, and so that needs to be addressed. That is a market distortion, where we see kind of subsidies to fossil fuels, and that is something that the treaty could potentially address in the future. But if we don't incentivize good practice, we're not even creating that level playing field that Hiro talked about. So I think that's just something that is really important, and I actually think that's an area where there's quite a bit of alignment between some NGOs and also the business community. We have the Business Coalition for a Plastics Treaty, which is a group of businesses, including some major fast-moving consumer goods companies and brands that are household names, who are saying we need to address plastic production in the treaty. So this isn't just a kind of mad NGO demand. This is actually, there's a clear business case for trying to sort out the issues around supply in order to help companies meet their commitments. So I think I wanted to really pick out what Hiro said there, because I think it's really interesting and important.
Absolutely. Thanks for calling that out, Chris. Our fourth question here, Hiro, I'm going to actually ask you to start us off with this. So we know that some countries want to focus on marine litter or waste management instead of upstream solutions. How can you explain why that alone will not solve the plastics crisis? Hiro, over to you.
Sure, thanks. It's actually interesting to see some countries do believe in just addressing sort of preventing pollution itself can be done by looking at just amount of the things going to the ocean, etc. I think the other analogy of sort of the bucket and then tap and kind of things it makes sense. The conversation around marine plastic pollution, which is critical and is obviously important, but solely focusing on that will basically miss the whole opportunity to stop the pollution to start with. It doesn't make sense to try to stop the leakage when there's a lot of water coming in. So I mean, without this analogy, but just the point is we really need to turn off the tap to be able to manage the waste. Just to give some figures, I mean, even look at the recycle rates. Up to 2015, the amount of the recycle have been managed was only 9%, so 91% are managed differently, and quite a large portion of it being to landfill, and then some of them being incinerated, etc. So I think these things might help, but I think the amount of the plastic and the waste we have are just too huge to handle with any sort of countermeasures to it. So that is, I think, in a simple way, that we have to talk about entire life cycle, especially production. Otherwise, there's just no way to tackle any marine plastic pollutions because it's just too much.
Absolutely. Griffins, Chris, anything to add on this?
Actually, I just wanted to emphasize on another important issue that is coming up, just like any other treaty. When you talk about principles that we need to focus on in a treaty, I wanted to emphasize, for us to address the challenges that we face with the plastic pollution, is really to look at how do we put the principle of precautionary principle at the forefront of negotiations, and the polluter pay principle, because we have to eventually have accountability for looking at all the role that all different stakeholders play, and safeguarding the environment and human health. So for development of such a global treaty, which is becomes a global international legally binding instrument, which states domesticate into the national law and inform development of national laws, the issue of precautionary principle, the principle of precautionary principle, is very critical, because we need to focus on prevention, not on just curative that I see in many instances we get ourselves into, then dealing with the problem when it has already become very huge, like what we have at the moment. So I think that will be very critical part of the discussions that need to be part of in the negotiation, so that how do we integrate the precautionary principle as well as the polluter pay principle, so that it's not just everyone taking for bringing these issues to the environment as a learning lesson to prevent another global environmental problem that we may face in the future, and then we don't get ourselves into a situation where we can't be able to solve it. Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to build on that, and thank you, Griffins. I love the precautionary principles, so any chance to hear it mentioned in these discussions gets me excited. But I think, sort of considering the question around the sort of marine litter thing, I think that's quite interesting, because, so yeah, I mean, I'm the ocean campaign leader at EIA, and my background is working on oceans issues, and I came at the plastic pollution topic through that whole idea of, and I think many people in the public as well, they also, the first they heard about plastic pollution was seeing, viral videos of turtles with straws up their nose, or whales with stomachs full of plastic. So it's an access point. In the UK, we call it, the blue planet effect, where we had David Attenborough on TV kind of shining a light on plastic pollution, on for the first time, really making this a huge public issue. So I don't want to say that marine litter or marine plastic pollution is not important, and I spend the other part of my life working on sea-based sources of plastic pollution at the International Maritime Organization, if you're ever interested to get into the weeds on that with me. But I think it's been really important to have that push, so that very visible face of plastic pollution, to start the conversation within national governments, regional governments, and then in the UN, because getting the mandate at the UN Environment Assembly to start looking at options related to marine litter and microplastics was the kind of gateway, or the doorway, to then having a conversation about the life cycle impacts of plastic. So that kind of background is really important. But I think one of the most important things that happened in the last year was that in Nairobi, when the new negotiating mandate for the Plastics Treaty was adopted, it was plastic pollution in all environments. And I think that narrative shift was hugely important, because it demonstrates that we've really expanded our understanding of the problem beyond marine litter. And now we see that, we're spraying pesticides onto fertilizers and pesticides onto crops, coated in microplastics. We're laying agricultural soil with plastic mulch. We're breathing plastics, we're swimming in plastics, they're in our bodies, they're in Mount Everest. I think now that we see that it's no longer such a narrow topic that could just be solved by, the ocean cleanup or some river interceptors, like, nice idea, but that's expensive and ineffective, and it doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the human health and human rights issues that are endemic throughout the plastic supply chain, and it won't actually get us anywhere near solving the problem.
Absolutely. Hiro, I saw you nodding your head along. Do you want to add stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think the marine plastic was indeed the gateway to. I think the visual of it, we saw those things really helped for us to think about in a bigger pictures the issue and the scale of this plastic pollution. But I think we can't go back to that. I think now that we realize and that we are aware of all the issues, I think it's really that we have to keep that conversation comprehensive enough to address all things. Just picking up a bit of the thinking, like the focus of marine is I think there's a bit of the thinking that the plastic is so useful, so as long as it doesn't pollute, then it's okay. That kind of thinking or feeling towards it, and then our life really depends on plastic right now. So I mean I can see that, but then I think that the solution will come in the whole pictures, from production, designing, and everything. So just focusing on such a kind of leakage bit will just miss so much opportunities that we have to change the way we do things with the economy and society. And it goes to the runaway plastic as well. The way we consume that is not just about plastic, because alternative substitution will not solve the problem itself. I mean, sometimes it does add another issues to it if you replace with different things. So that's it. So yeah, I think just not to miss opportunities that we have with the global treaty to really address it whole life cycle. I think leakage, it kind of focus the leakage will be kind of waste of opportunity. So that would be maybe the message to those that still thinking a bit of that aspect. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well said, Hiro. Definitely it would be a waste of this once in a generation opportunity if we only focused on plastic leakage. So we have one more planned question, and then we're going to go over to all the questions in the chat, which will be great. So we've got our last question here, which is focused on fossil fuels and petrochemicals. So we know that the fossil fuel industry and the petrochemical industries will participate heavily in negotiations, which will undermine the strength and ambition of the treaty. What should be done to counter their impact in the treaty space? Chris, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Griffins as well. Hiro, whoever wants to start. I think maybe Chris, you're the most eager to talk about this.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I am eager to talk about it. I don't know if I have the answers, but I think, something that, we've been thinking about quite a lot, and I think it's a view that's shared with a lot of the civil society and rights holders who are following the plastics treaty negotiations, but it's around the idea of equitable participation and, who has a seat at the table. And I think that, it's very problematic, which is like a real understatement. It's highly problematic to have these companies that have a real vested interest in the treaty's failure to have an equal seat at the negotiating table to say, communities that have been impacted by the build out of petrochemical facilities in places like Kansas Alley in the US, but also many other places around the world, indigenous peoples, many communities. And so, an ask of civil society has been, not all civil society, but those that we work with, has been to look at ways that we can lock those companies out of the negotiations. And that might sound crazy, but that there is a precedent for that in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, where tobacco companies were restricted from participating in the negotiations because they stood so much to lose by tightened regulation on tobacco that it wasn't seem appropriate that they could be there at the table. And that is clearly the case here. And when you look at, for example, the climate negotiations, you see huge fossil fuel industry presence. You see fossil fuel companies even on government delegations. You often see fossil fuel company delegations vastly outnumbering government delegations. And that has been a kind of unchecked participation in that process. And, I'm not saying that there is necessarily a direct link between watered down ambition or a lack of success, but it seems highly likely that that is the case. And so I think that, as Caitlin said, we have this once in a generation opportunity to design a strong and effective and robust plastics treaty. And I believe that the best way to do that would be to restrict the participation of companies that are producing plastics from those negotiations. But I guess that's the simplest way I can put it. I'm sure the others would have something to build on that as well.
Griffins, can I pass it over to you?
Thank you. Maybe I can chime in, and just also to really, because this is a member state-led process and we have definitely stakeholders with vested interest. We are there to bring, the voice and of the public interest. And I just want to reflect that as the negotiators, which is member states, go through the negotiations, they need to be reminded of the right to a clean and healthy environment, which is really core in many national governments' constitutions, that the public interest comes first, and the protection on human health and environment and the human rights. And where we have such vested interest, that there is need to relook into these public interest core principles, because ultimately with the continued pollution, we have ripple effect in terms of the global burden of diseases, as we just mentioned, around the impact on health. We live in an environment where our environment really determine how healthy we are. So this is very critical reflections that need to be at the constant, so that the underhand lobbying that, of course, the private interest bring do not take precedence to what public interest need to be. And this is a reflection that all member states that negotiates for the protection of their citizens' right to a clean, healthy environment is achieved. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, adding to that, I think it's always a case where the private interests are heavily involved in such a critical discussion. So it's not a new thing, but I have to add that this corporate capture of the space and the discussions isn't limited to the plastic treaties, as Chris mentioned, the other treaty discussion, but also as a UN general. We have seen an increased number of the private partnership and also private corporation engaging in the critical discussions that affect the life of millions and billions. So in that sense, I think it's going to be crucial that this community, say those who care about the plastic pollutions, will obviously highlight these issues within the space, but also will highlight, and maybe in solidarity with others, to really highlight at the global level with in other processes as well. So I think just to highlight this, not just within the space, but as a global phenomena that is taking place at the same time, I think going to be crucial. Plus, even though negotiation, it's kind of easy to say that we have a lot of lobbies flooding the negotiation because it's kind of visible, but the real sort of influencing will take place at the national level. And then we can, from my engagement as well, I can say that the industry group have been very close touch with the government. So it's nothing surprising and nothing wrong per se that they have a right to speak, sure. But I think it's going to be critical that all of us engaging in this space to do the work at both national and global level to really counter narrative, dismiss debunking their sort of narrative where needed with evidences and the sciences, what the actual sciences are telling. Plus, obviously, the narrative of the human rights and the global commons, and this repeatedly mentioned this once in a generation opportunity. So it's going to be hard work, but I think I would say it's worth fighting for.
Absolutely worth fighting for. Yeah, and we only have until 2024 next year to get this all figured out. So thank you, panelists, for going through these guided questions with me, but we're going to turn it over to the audience for questions. And our first question is, it's from very early in our conversation, but I think it's still relevant. So, oh, awesome. Thanks, Griffins. Griffins has to drop off to join a regional meeting. Very important. Thank you so much, Griffins. And if we have any questions directed to you, we'll make sure to get answers for him. Bye, Griffins. Okay. So, Chris and Hiro, it's just us. So, our first question is, what are the key countries that need to reduce production, and what are the countries most affected by plastic production? Who would like to start?
I could start maybe on I guess the most affected countries. I think that's quite an interesting sort of way in. I've spent quite a lot of time sort of speaking with countries from small island developing states, and that's a really specific geography, large ocean states, small island developing states. So countries they're not producers of plastics, they rely heavily on imports, but they're disproportionately burdened by the impact of plastic pollution and have very little agency to affect change when they're not responsible for producing or designing products in country. And so, they're basically reliant on global rules and global obligations around things like production and product design, which, as we know, don't currently exist, and that's why they're calling for a strong plastics treaty. But also, it's why, as I understand it, small island developing states, for example, are calling for measures in the treaty around remediation. So, I think a lot of people are really familiar with, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch as one example, but remediation can mean a lot of things. It can also mean things like legacy dump sites, for example, which are at high risk of being washed out to sea in adverse weather, just as one example. But also there are, coastal communities that are really blighted by the long-term impacts of plastic pollution washing up on their shores, or not having any infrastructure domestically to manage them. So I think the kind of SIDS case is really interesting, and they're definitely a group to watch in the negotiations as they get organized and start thinking about how do they kind of get to the sort of twin objectives of reducing production. So long term, their situation is improved, but also dealing with the immediate need of kind of legacy pollution and remediation from what they've been impacted with for sort of a really long time now. On the kind of producing countries, I don't think there's any sort of shocking names in there. And I think looking at how the negotiations play out is also very related to the countries that are producing a lot of plastic. Maybe Hiro, you want to take that one? I think you're nodding, so I'll kind of chuck that bit over to you.
Lifting the burden. So I think there are two aspects. One thing is, first of all, petrostates. Obviously, that is the source of plastics. So I think countries that produce oils will play, and the gas as well, will play a huge role in defining the success of this treaty, right? They need to shift their production and then shift their business model from relying on the oils and stuff. This is not just about plastic, this is about climate crisis. So in that sense, those petrostates will play a huge role. But plus, it's not just petrostates actually, but in this plastic, the difference, because I engaged in the COP, so climate conversation, the difference is in that sense, here we have those production plastics, so that adds another layer of countries. And if you look at the figures, the NAFTA and the Europe produce about just above 30% of the plastics, and the 50% come from Asia, and the rest come from the other regions. So it's not just traditional petrostates that are solely responsible for it, but if you think of a production plastic, then those countries play the role as well. Not to stop there, if you think about global audits, whose plastic rubbish should be are found the most frequently, then the names are always coming from the global north and plus some of the emerging economy. So then those companies have a huge responsibility, and obviously the countries of those will play the role. So with that, I think it's going to be not just about petrostates, but also the NAFTA and the EU as the region produces about 30% will play the role. So yeah, that's, I would say, these country needs be really taking up the responsibility to fix this. Yes.
I could just add to that as well. I think that was great, Hiro. So thank you for explaining that way more clearly than I could. But I think, so you have countries, so like the US, the UK, the EU, but also, you know, Russia, China, Japan, who are big producers of plastic, but also consumers of plastic. And I think it would be remiss not to mention the impact of the global waste trade in also kind of driving a lot of the problems that we see. So when we talk about who's impacted by plastic pollution, we're also talking about the kind of global north, global south dynamics, where countries like mine, like the UK, produces and consumes a lot of plastic, and under the guise of recycling, exports the majority of it overseas, often to an unknown fate. And that's really driving kind of capacity challenges when it comes to recycling in importing countries. And it's also leading to mismanagement, such as dumping, burning in some of those receiving countries, because the infrastructure in those countries that are importing the plastic from the global north, it was never designed to manage that amount of import, that amount of capacity. It was designed to manage national capacity. So what it means basically is that we're sending our plastic overseas, like ticking, you know, job well done, and then essentially it's ending up in the environment. So I think the relationship between those countries that are producing a lot, those countries that are consuming a lot, and those countries that are exporting, and then those that are feeling the impact, are all highly connected in what is a very kind of complex global trade of production and consumption. And so the impacts of what one country is doing is so strongly felt in another. It's part of the reason why we need a global treaty, because, you know, we could ban plastic waste exports from the UK. I mean, I'd love to, and it would be impactful, but it wouldn't actually solve issues around production, trade, and export, globally speaking. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's quite important to think about. And when we think about, you know, communities, and also how impacted communities are not, it's not just impacts being felt in SIDS or in the global south. You know, I sort of touched on the issue around petrochemical build out and those communities that are living on the front line of that build out. You know, the human health impacts are absolutely shocking. And it's really, you know, it's just like horrifying to think that there's huge planned expansion in petrochemical build out expected over the next decade. And there's very little consideration about those communities that will bear the brunt of it. And those communities are often lower income. They're, you know, targeted because it's seen as easier to build out in their communities. And so I think that a really important thing that we can do within not just the negotiations themselves, but in the kind of space around it, is to make that story come to the surface. So, you know, the idea to cap production is not just a kind of crazy pie in the sky idea. It's about protecting communities for the future. You know, it's about human and environmental health.
Absolutely. And Chris, you set us up really well for our next audience question there. So talking about responsibility. So what are our suggestions for a more effective and inclusive monitoring and evaluation process after this treaty is launched? I know it's a big question.
Sure.
Yeah, straight away offer it to Hiro.
So I think I go back to the sort of narrative of global national. So I think for the global, we expect that there will be conference of party or meeting of parties coming after the treaty is agreed to continuously monitor and update, for example, what kind of plastic need to be limited, etc. I mean, that's kind of what we want. But the point is, I think there would be a continuous process going forward. In that process, we have to make sure the stakeholders, major groups, and other stakeholders and the rights holders have adequate say in the process, so they can actually contribute meaningfully to the discussion. That would be very crucial, because yes, treaty itself is a huge thing, but it's not just if you even think about Montreal or Minamata, all of them is not solved on the day of signing. It actually takes years to have effect and actually solve the crisis. So in that way, I think we have to ensure that all the stakeholders will be able to engage in that process meaningfully and quite substantively. Plus, the country level engagement will be crucial. In each country, there will be or should be some sort of monitoring or reporting mechanism that coming out. In the human rights context, for example, there are NGOs that report, for example, the violation or compliance issues of the party. So similar to that, I think those who might not be able to engage global level right away, but can engage at national level, will have a huge role to play afterwards. So the question of how we can form that kind of say network or coalition at the national level to engage with the government way forward will be crucial, not just during the negotiation, but also afterwards. So that's going to be, I would say, the key things that we have to start working on it to ensure that we won't let it go after the treaty is signed.
I think that was really comprehensive. I think the only thing I would maybe add is, so earlier on I talked about how there were these two parallel working groups at the negotiations, and one was doing the kind of what might seem to be a bit less sexy implementation stuff. But basically everything that Hiro just talked about is actually the sort of conversations that will be happening in that means of implementation or implementation measures working group. And so what the science policy mechanism looks like and what the compliance mechanism looks like and what stakeholder participation within that looks like will all sort of be kind of discussed within that context. And I think that, something that the scientists coalition who are working in this space are asking for is making sure, for example, that any scientific body that's established and any science that's being used to inform the negotiations is informed by a really robust conflict of interest policy. So just as an example, these are the types of things that we can make sure that anything that's being developed is equitable, fair, inclusive, and also based on independent and unbiased science and information. So I think that kind of science policy discussion will be very interesting. What will the sort of scientific technical body look like? And how do we ensure that whatever we design doesn't create the problems that we see in other agreements where essentially the science is all industry funded and therefore is used to rebut any progress? So it's really, this piece sounds quite dry, but it's actually really important. And similarly, the compliance mechanism, as I understand it in the Montreal Protocol, it's a kind of compliance mechanism, which means that, if a party is not meeting their obligations under the agreement, they're basically supported to come back into compliance. So it's not a kind of punitive compliance mechanism. And I think there's something that we could probably learn from that here. And it's related to the conversation on financing, because a lot of the time countries are not compliant because they don't have adequate financing to meet their obligations. So it's really, really critical that the treaty has an appropriate financial mechanism to deliver on the ambition of the treaty. Like all of the stuff that we've discussed here is really exciting and it would be great and it would be transformative. But if there's no money to pay the bill, then it's not going to happen.
Can I just one thing that reminds me a bit of the conversation happened in the process of agreeing the post 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So in the beginning, we had this major group and other stakeholders that have youth, women, labor, people with disability, etc. So we have all those inside, and then when the implementation of the SDG came to Japan, the language they took was this civil society, academia, business, and something. So basically just 4 categories. Then what happened was basically all these stakeholders basically clamped into the civil society space, like women, news, and people with disability, etc. All of them put into the one category and just left with one seat and say, well, this is a meaningful engagement. So I think it's there's a risk of not naming some groups in the process, and to that end, it's going to be crucial that if we want to ensure the inclusive space, the in that treaty, we should have a good discussion around who are the stakeholders. I think obviously the agreed languages within the UNEA should be the guiding starting point, but I think we have other rights holder groups that should have a space. So, but if we leave it to some of the discussion by the member states, what happens is they always go to relevant stakeholders, and then after the countries to decide, I think that has a lot of danger in it. So we have to have that conversation and ensure that we, sort of give the space to the different rights holder group, their own autonomous space to engage in the process to ensure that actually no one is left behind.
Thanks for that, Hiro. We have just a few minutes left, and I think that's a lovely note to wrap us up on meaningful participation from lots of different stakeholders is going to be critical in this once-in-a-generation opportunity to get the most ambitious, strong plastics treaty we could possibly get in such a short time frame. So Hiro, Chris, any last concluding remarks before we end today's live?
While Hiro was talking, I was first of all getting really inspired, but also I was trying to think about how to summarize this hour-long discussion, which I found really interesting. And I've come up with the 3 Ps, which I think, and I've just made this up, so I'm going to workshop it. But it sounds like from what we've talked about, there are 3 Ps, which are really important. 1 is dealing with plastic production. 2 is on participation and ensuring it's representative, equitable, and intersectional, but without polluters. That's like a sneaky 4th P. And then payment. So what is the financial mechanism for the treaty, and how do we ensure that it's fit for purpose to deliver on the ambitions of reducing production and ending plastic pollution? So that's what I would say to wrap up my thoughts.
Love that. Hiro, do you have another 3 Ps to share with us on your final thoughts?
Well, I don't have a 3 P, but I have 3 things. One is, I think, really the production and the phase of virgin plastics and the ban runaway plastics. So I think the production side comes very important. And the second, I think, just transition, coming back to the first thing I think I've said in this live stream, the just transition will be crucial to ensure that this treaty will not leave no one behind. So it's that's 2. And lastly, I think the user refill repair, this component should be really our future, and they should guide us. So the dedicating enough conversation to it and coming up with the ideas around it, and that's where the innovation needs to take place. So I would say these 3 things will be the last message.
Thank you, Hiro, and thank you, Chris, and thank you, Griffins, who had to leave early. This was a wonderful conversation. It was so great chatting with all of you, and we'll see each other in Paris in just a few weeks. And I just want to say thank you to our audience and anyone watching this after the fact. Please feel free to share with your friends and leave comments, and we'll try to get answers to all of your questions that we didn't talk about today. But thank you for joining and tuning in today. That's all, folks.